Okay, I want to spend a little bit of time in part three here talking about the first generation of dopamine blocking drugs. Now, these may not be used that commonly, but kind of like lithium, they are important tools to have in our toolkit, and it's worth discussing them at least a little bit. I want to group both our conversation about first and second generation antipsychotics. I'm going to group the drugs by their potency. So if we take a look at this sort of continuum here, on the side of lower potency, we have drugs like chlorpromazine or thorazine, and then we have medium potency drugs. So the chlorpromazine drug might be something like several hundred milligrams would be a typical dose, so a less potent drug. A more medium potency drug might be something like perfenazine, which is going to be dosed in the tens. So, maybe somewhere between 8 and say 24 milligrams of perfenazine. And then finally, we have the high potency drugs, which are going to be measured usually in single digits. So something like haloperidol. And so we'll use a drug from each group as kind of a prototypical drug, and then talk about some of the other drugs that would fall into that category. So a classic low potency dopamine blocking drug, and what I've done up here, so you can take a look at this on your slide handouts, is looking at that receptor profile for each of these drugs. So we can start to kind of decode this and understand why we get certain effects and side effects from these drugs. So, and I've also added some vintage drug ads for your enjoyment here. So chlorpromazine, thorazine, first drug comes out in 1952, and it is typically dosed in the hundreds of milligrams. So you might see 4 or 5, even 800 milligrams of chlorpromazine if you're using this drug. Typically starting out, in the tens would be a typical starting dose. And this is going to have obviously dopamine blockade, but it's also going to have these antihistaminic, anticholinergic, and norepinephrine blocking activity as well. So we see up here we're blocking all of the dopamine receptors reasonably robustly, especially D2. We also see antihistamine effects. So the histamine blockade is going to cause sedation. It's going to cause weight gain as well. We see blockade of the acetylcholine muscarinic 1 receptor. This is going to cause those classic anticholinergic side effects, such as blurry vision and urinary retention. But interestingly, building in that anti-cholinergic side effect is going to be as if almost sort of like there is some cogentin built into that, if you will. So it's going to help reduce some of the extrapyramidal side effects that you might see. Now, a lot of times when people take chlorpromazine, they also complain of things like orthostasis or sedation or dizziness, and some of that is accounted for by this blockade it has on norepinephrine alpha 1 receptors. So this is how we can start to kind of decode how the receptor activity maps onto these effects and side effects. And just as an interesting aside, even though there were no second generation antipsychotics when this medication came out, it just by chance actually happens to have blockade on serotonin 2A. So sometimes people refer to chlorpromazine as being actually having receptor activity that's a little more similar to a second generation antipsychotic, just to make things a little bit more confusing. But this is definitely considered a first generation antipsychotic in most of your texts and references. Chlorpromazine, it certainly has a lot of utility, which is probably why it's still considered a essential medication by the World Health Organization. Its cousin, prochlorperazine, is also used for nausea. You could use chlorpromazine for nausea, quite honestly. In general, the lower doses are going to be more sedating, and the higher doses are going to have more of that antipsychotic effect. Taking a look at a medium potency uh, first generation dopamine blocking drug would be perfenazine. So this was also known as Trilafon. Doses typically in the sort of double digit range. And we see that again, strong blockade on dopamine receptors, particularly dopamine 2 and 3, which is what's giving it that antipsychotic effect. And it has moderate antihistaminic effects. So that tends to make it a little less offensive in weight gaining, moderately sedating, but probably not as strongly sedating as something like chlorpromazine. It has a little bit of that muscarinic 1 receptor antagonism, so the anticholinergic effect, and it's just enough to kind of make it so you often don't need to co-prescribe something for the extrapyramidal symptoms. Um, and also similarly sort of moderate norepinephrine receptor blockade. So we get a little bit of orthostasis, and we get sedation and dizziness, but like I said, less than chlorpromazine. Now, profenazine, it's interesting. So there was a study, we've talked about the STAR-D study. We've also talked about the STEP-BD study. So those were large National Institutes of Mental Health, so federally funded studies on these mental health conditions. There was a third one called the CATIE trial, and the CATIE trial was looking at schizophrenia, specifically looking at the new medications that were at the time. This is 20 years ago. These second generation antipsychotics coming out to see which one was more effective and how did they compare to the older medications. So they did this kind of classic study where they, I believe, had 5 different medications that were, then the outcome was how long do you stay on the medication? Because we knew that many people with schizophrenia will discontinue medications. And so rather than try and figure out exactly why people stop the medication, they just said all-cause discontinuation. So either you stopped it because you had too many side effects, or you stopped it because you just didn't like it, or you stopped it because it didn't work. Didn't matter. The outcome measure was how long did you stay on the medication? And everyone thought that the newer medications were going to win hands down because we'd all been told that they were more tolerable and they were more effective than the old medications. And the interesting thing was at the end of the day, the 2 winners of the race were very unexpected. So one was olanzapine, which was surprising because um, there was a lot of complaints about side effects from that medication. The other was profenazine, which was surprising because we'd all sort of been told by the marketing content that that medication was old-fashioned and didn't work very well. Turned out a lot of patients didn't mind it. So when that came out, I sort of took page from that and started using a little more Trilofan or profenazine, as it's called, often as a adjunct. So somebody would be on a second generation antipsychotic at a reasonably high dose. So say something like 300, 400 milligrams of quetiapine, and they were still having some breakthrough psychosis symptoms. And for whatever reason, I couldn't go up on the first drug. I might add a little bit of profenazine, maybe 4 milligrams, 8 milligrams, to kind of add a little bit of dopamine blockade, just enough to address some of the psychosis symptoms. And so I found it to be a useful tool like that for in that way. It's generic and cheap. And then here's a classic first generation antipsychotic, haloperidol. So this is Haldol, single digit dosing, so high potency. And you see it has this very strong dopamine blockade, especially on D2 and D3 receptors. And that's what is going to result in its antipsychotic effects, but it's also when it blocks those same receptors in other areas of the brain, such as the nigrostriatal tract or the tuberoinfundibular tract, we're going to see things like extrapyramidal symptoms and prolactinemia. So that's the downside to this. The good side doesn't really have any antihistaminic effects, so it's pretty weight neutral. By itself, it's not actually that sedating. A lot of times it is, I mean, it can have some sedation because of this norepinephrine blockade. But oftentimes haloperidol is co-administered with something like benzotropine or diphenhydramine, and often in emergency settings with a benzodiazepine like lorazepam. So your classic kind of B52 cocktail. So that's, or the 5250 as it's sometimes called, is 5 milligrams of haloperidol, 2 milligrams of lorazepam, and 50 milligrams of diphenhydramine, usually given intramuscularly. It's quite sedating. Some of that is from the haloperidol, but a lot of that's coming from the lorazepam and the diphenhydramine. That diphenhydramine would be administered for its anticholinergic effects. You might also give benzotropine or cogentin to address the fact that this drug really doesn't have any built-in anticholinergic blockade. So to avoid those kind of acute EPS symptoms, we're going to usually co-administer this with one of those drugs. And it has very little activity on serotonin 2A. So this is really your classic high potency first generation dopamine blocking drug. It's still used certainly in emergency settings where is probably most commonly deployed, but there are also patients that have been on decanoate, which is the original long-acting injectable technology, and do really well on this medication and can and should be continued on it if it's helpful for them, especially if they've tried more contemporary medications and not found them to be beneficial. We used to use this medication a lot in sort of small doses in people with delirium in med-surg units. Generally try and stay away from that these days, but you still sometimes see that. And you know, it's a kind of a classic example of a really dependable drug that you probably would not want to be on for long, long periods of time if you can avoid it. Okay, so that's the first generation antipsychotics, dopamine blocking drugs. We'll move on to the second generation in the next section. Thanks.